Supreme Court of the United States struck down Donald Trump's executive orders on emergency tariffs as illegal. At a news conference Friday afternoon, U.S. time, U.S. President Donald Trump criticized the justices, two of whom he appointed, who ruled against him. He later invoked Section 122 of the Trade Act 1974 by slapping 10% global tariffs on all trading partners, and just 24 hours later raised that to 15%, the maximum permitted under the Trade Act. Now, this new tariff rate of 15% is valid for 150 days and may be extended only upon the approval of the U.S. Congress. According to a White House fact sheet, exemptions will continue for sectors under separate probes, including pharmaceuticals, as well as goods entering the U.S. under the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement. So what does the Section 122, under which Trump's first introduced the 10% tariff and later raised them to 15%, exactly say? Well, Section 122 is part of the Trade Act of 1974, which gives the U.S. president a temporary authority to impose tariffs without long investigations or detailed reviews. Specifically, the president may impose a temporary import surcharge called a tariff of up to 15%. The tariff is meant to help address situations where the U.S. faces a large and serious balance of payments deficit, essentially when the country is importing far more than it is exporting in a way that it hurts the international financial position. Any tariffs under Section 122 can only last up to 150 days unless Congress votes to extend them. No formal investigation or multi-agency process is required. The president only needs to make the determination and publish the tariff order. Trump argues this keeps the tariff legally valid while his team explores more permanent trade laws or other ways to continue tariffs. Remember, no president has ever used Section 122 before. Now, as countries across the world study the Supreme Court ruling and Washington's latest moves, let's take a closer look at what it means for global trade before we analyze what this specifically means for India.
U.S. President Donald Trump on Saturday said he will raise a temporary tariff from 10% to 15% on U.S. imports from all countries, the maximum level allowed under the law. The move is in response to the U.S. Supreme Court's decision to invalidate his previous tariff program that it said exceeded his authority as president.
The Supreme Court's ruling on tariffs is deeply disappointing.
The new levies are grounded in a separate law known as Section 122 that allows tariffs up to 15%, but requires congressional approval to extend them after 150 days. Trump, in a social media post, said he would use that period to work on issuing other legally permissible tariffs. French President Emmanuel Macron on Saturday weighed in on the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling.
First, I think this invites everyone to reflect. It doesn't seem bad to have Supreme Courts and therefore a rule of law. For those who think Supreme Courts create problems in political life, a Supreme Court looked at the Constitution and said, this is not in line with the Constitution. Now everyone says this is great. There you go. It's good to have checks and balances in democracies.
Trump has shown little sign of backing off his global trade war. In the hours since the court's 6-3 decision, he has attacked individual justices in personal terms and insisted he retained the power to impose tariffs as he sees fit.
All right, so that's a deep dive into Section 122. But what does this specifically mean for India? Well, India now faces a reduced tariff rate of 15%, down from the earlier proposed 18%. Remember, following an agreement on a framework for an interim trade deal earlier this month, the U.S. announced it will cut the reciprocal tariff on India to 18% and remove the additional 25% secondary tariffs. Now, up until last week, India's goods exports to the U.S. were subjected to 25% reciprocal tariff. The February 6th joint statement on the framework for an interim trade deal proposed lowering this tariff rate to 18%, but the change was yet to be implemented. Now, starting tomorrow, that's February 24th, the 15% global tariff rate will apply to India's exports. Now, this brings India at par with other countries like China, South Korea, Japan, almost all of ASEAN, plus Kazakhstan, Turkey, South Africa, Libya, Brazil, Mexico, and Canada, which will all be subjected to this lower tariff rate of 15%. So let's break this down with our experts, in fact, joining us on the show this morning. Barnik, Chitran, Maitra, PE investor, managing partner, Chrysalis Equities, and Mitali, Nikore, founder and chief economist, Nikore Associates. First up to you, Barnik, 15% for 150 days. Then what? Will the US Congress, that has anyway been divided over Trump tariffs, allow the tariff rate to stay?
Yeah, so I think let's reflect on the 15% first. I think there is still a question mark because the 15% as per section 122 is actually framed as a surcharge. So if you look at the full 15%, it is supposed to be in one scenario added over the 3.5% of the most favored nation tariff. So it's quite likely, again, subject to fine print getting clarified, that the tariff rate for all countries moves to 18.5%. You make an important point that 18.5% is likely to be applied to all nations and there's no differential basis. Now, let me give your viewers a little bit of a backdrop of Section 122. Section 122 has a very unique history in the US, as in no US president has applied it. The genesis of Section 122 was actually Nixon in 1971 applying an international surcharge of 10% on Trading with Enemies Act, which the Congress felt was far-reaching and gave him the buffer of Section 122 to deal with the collapse of the gold standard and an international payments crisis at that point. Now, while the GATT Section 12 or Rule 12 allows countries to impose such rules, it is frowned upon by GATT. It is quite likely that several countries, including China and European Union, may challenge this in GATT, and several prominent economists, Geeta Gopinath among them, have confirmed on X that actually the US is not facing a balance of payments crisis because the trade deficit does not account to be having a balance of payments crisis. So this is a very generous interpretation of balance of payments crisis. I expect this to get challenged at WTO by several nations, maybe not India. And after 150 days, the likelihood of Congress extending it is also reasonably low, because another development last month is that a group of Republican congressmen broke away from Trump to actually invalidate his Canada tariffs. So the likelihood of Congress allowing this global surcharge applied to all nations after 150 days is also unlikely. So again, I think there's no need to react with haste. There is still a lot of flux going on. There's the issue of the tariff refund, which is still to be litigated.
Of course.
The weekend, Costco has already sued the US government. So there are so many moving parts. I think, if any, India is now in a position of strength, right? And the tariff deal signed as of, or agreed to upon last month, as of now, is completely worthless, with a much stronger Indian negotiating position as we speak today.
All right, Barnik, we will come to the refunds issue specifically in just a bit. But Mitali, I want to understand from you, 15%, at least for 150 days, unless there is more litigation at WTO and Trump is forced to sort of withdraw this 15% as well. But 15% definitely better than 18%, which is much better than 25%, which is a lot better than 50%. And these are all the tariff rates that India has been subjected to over the last 11 months. But the volatility and the indecision continues to be scary. How should businesses plan their trade with the United States?
No, absolutely, Kartik, and I totally agree with Barnik. With this analysis that he's presented. At the end of the day, we are entering an era where there has been a clear sign from the Supreme Court in the US that the president had overreached. They pointed out in their judgment that this is a clear case of presidential overreach. So, what we are going to start to see in the next 6 to 8 months is literally a situation where the president is then grasping at straws. Even with the application of this section 122. I mean, at the end of the day, this is also an example of grasping at straws. You literally need something to justify the legality of an action which is actually illegal in US law, which is illegal in international trade. And if we look at the international trade architecture, whether it's the World Trade Organization, whether it's the GATT, as Barnik was talking about, the agreement on the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, these agreements were actually spearheaded by the United States. I mean, it was in the 1960s and 70s that the United States actually engineered a global order where there would be more and more free trade, open trade, less trade barriers, whether it's tariffs, which are direct trade barriers,
Yeah.
or even non tariff barriers. So, honestly, in the months to come, I believe that global trade will be subject to a lot more scrutiny, a lot more uncertainty, and a lot of, just actions which may not be justified in the law.
All right. Of course, that justification and the legality is going to continue to be a question that looms over US President Donald Trump and his tariffs. But remember, this end of 150 days will leave the US president with just about another 100 odd days before the midterm elections. And we don't know how that's really going to pan out for Donald Trump. But stay with me, Barnik and Mitali, because there's more to the story. And this comes by way of India rescheduling the proposed meeting of their chief trade negotiators, which was set to begin in Washington this week, as both sides now assess the implications of the US Supreme Court's verdict on sweeping tariffs. The Indian delegation, led by Commerce Ministry Joint Secretary Darpan Jain, will not travel to the US this week. Rather, will now meet at a mutually convenient date after reviewing these latest developments. Remember, the US continues to remain India's largest goods trading partner, with bilateral trade touching $186 billion in 2024-25. So, Barnik, in effect, where do these developments leave our framework of the interim trade deal with the US? Can we now assume that that framework is pretty much null and void and there's going to be another clear round of negotiations or not? And we'll just have to wait it out to see which way the story goes.
No, I think it is very clear that that framework has been held null and void by the recent Supreme Court ruling. If you look at the entire history behind the Liberation Day tariffs, I think Trump imposed those tariffs to get leverage with trading partners to get to deals he would find favorable. Now, in the absence of a legal basis, his strength disappears. And I think the way the Indian delegation is thinking about it is that now is the opportunity, in case the US delegation does want to come back to the table and negotiate, is to negotiate a far more favorable deal with the Americans beyond the deal which we'll have, which includes dropping the rate from 18% below to something closer to 7-8%, revisiting Section 232 sanctions, where the duties on steel and aluminum continue and were out of this trade agreement. And also, instead of giving blanket access to some agricultural products from the US to India, actually proposing a far more phased access with a phased duty structure. So this just strengthens India's hand to negotiate a far more favorable deal than the one which was agreed to in terms of a framework a few weeks back. And please note, right, I think the Indian negotiators will be well aware that whatever trade deal they now negotiate with the president still has to be ratified by US Congress, because the Supreme Court has very clearly articulated that tariff is a tax and the purse of power resides with the Congress and not with the president. So any deal negotiated with the US by any country has to be subject to Congress ratification, which only, by the way, with midterms and a likely change of power, at least in the House of Representatives, is only going to strengthen the hand of negotiating countries like India. So all in all, it's actually good news for India. We are likely to get a far more favorable trade deal in the medium term than what we had agreed to in the last few weeks.
All right. So, Mitali, I'm not sure whether we'll call India being lucky or India being smart in not striking the trade deal earlier. But where does this leave India's sort of competitive advantage over the rest of the world? Because we were celebrating the better tariff rates that we had got as compared to many other trading partners of the US. So where does this leave India and the rest of the world now, especially with our export competitiveness, which is now pretty much flattened out with respect to the rest of US's trading partners?
So I think Kartik, it's two sides of one coin. I think the two regions which have done very well in this entire period of turmoil in global trade. The first region I would say is the European Union, because the European Union used this momentum of losing out its most preferred trading partner, that's the US, to actually stitch up deals with regions across the world and diversify their trade channels immensely. So think about how the EU signed deals with Latin America, a deal which actually was stalled for nearly 25 years, and then went ahead and signed, agreements with China, signed, the mother of all deals with India. So that puts the EU actually at the center of a lot of global trade in the new global trading order. India has, I would say, that is the second region which has done very, very well, because if we look at our own, trade deals that have come through in the last 3 to 4 months, we have gone ahead, had trade deals with Australia, New Zealand, the UK, of course, the EU mother of all deals, and also with the Gulf countries, which again, within the global south, places India at the center of a lot of global value chains and supply chains. So,
Right.
these two regions, I feel, will continue to do well in the years to come, and diversifying away from the US will continue to be a priority regardless of what happens. In terms of our hand, I just want to say we've inherited a strong hand, but that doesn't mean that we don't invest in our domestic capacities. We have to continue to improve our export competitiveness in terms of logistics, in terms of processes, in terms of manufacturing, so that we continue to offer, export competitive products to the world, and also on innovation, because we can't rest on our laurels. At any point, anything can change in the global trading world. That's the one lesson we are taking away.
Absolutely. Uncertainty is the only certainty. And it seems from what I'm hearing from you, Mitali, that the side stories of the India-US trade deal by way of all the other FTAs that we signed over the last 1 year have turned out to be bigger stories than the India-US trade deal itself. But let's leave it at that. Thank you, Mitali, Nikore, Barnik, Chitran, Maitra, for your time this morning.